Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
So we're in the midst of the Exodus story. You're right there, Rabbi Aaron?
Yeah. I'll get organized.
All right.
Proceed.
Go ahead and have a seat. We're in the midst of the Exodus story. We're actually going to be reading about the plagues, some of the plagues in this week's Parsha. And it begins in a very strange way. So I want us to turn to page 351 in the books, the larger of the books that are in front of you. It is Exodus chapter 6, verse 2 is where our overall weekly portion starts. God spoke to Moses and said to him, Ani Adonai, I am God. Now, for those who are familiar with Hebrew, you know that that name of God, those four letters, Yud, He, Vav, He, often called the Tetragrammaton, if you want to be fancy and scholarly about it, right? When we see that, that is like saying God's proper name, right? We often think that God's name is God. That's not God's name. That's God's job description, right? But this is God's name. And it's actually a name that we don't pronounce. It's a name that traditionally was only pronounced by the high priest on Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies, right? That's the only time that that name was pronounced. And so we've actually lost the pronunciation of it because once the temple was destroyed, we no longer know exactly how to pronounce that name. There are scholars that have come and said maybe this, maybe that, but we really don't know for sure. So he's saying, I am, and he gives his proper name. And then he says something very interesting. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, a different name. But I did not make myself known to them by my name, and that's the actual name. So my question for you is, A, is this true? And B, why? What's going on here? What is this moment with Moses all about? What do you think? I'm going to ask you before I give you my opinion. Michal. This is something momentous. Good. And therefore,
well, it may concern more than Moses. It might be bigger than him. As with the patriarchs, it was a message to each of them. But now it concerns something bigger.
Okay. So it may concern something bigger than Moses. We're going to get back to that. That's good. What else? What else is going on here? Let's ask the first question first, right? We just got done reading the book of Genesis. We read it from mid-October until just a few weeks ago when we started with the book of Exodus. And there's actually two different names in the book of Genesis typically that God is called, right? One is Elohim, which literally means God, right? And the other is Yud He Vav He, this name. So we actually, if we look at the book of Genesis, we actually see this name being used in the book of Genesis. So why is God saying to Moses, they didn't know me by that name, they only knew me as El Shaddai? Anybody want to take a crack at that? Why? This is the audience participation part of our afternoon, our morning. What do you? Ooh, yes, I like that. I'm revealing myself in a special way, a different way than I had before. Good. What else? Anybody else? Mark.
So when God introduced himself to patriarchs, it was almost like an introduction. And they could perceive him, or they could learn about him and what he does, his power, everything in a certain way. With Moses, it's going much, much deeper. I mean, there's going to be so much more happening and so much more taking people from being, it's not even Jews yet, it's Israelites, to becoming something more.
Yeah. Yeah, so the story, and I think you and Michal are lining up a little bit here, and I think we're on the right track, right? The story in the book of Genesis is almost parochial. It's very specific, right? There are things going on, but now what's going on here is much larger. There's going to be a lot more going on in the book of Exodus and following than went on in the book of Genesis. Okay? Anybody else? It's interesting because what happened between the end of the book of Genesis and now? Yes.
We discussed last time, it goes from a story of individuals to a story of a nation with a mission.
Good. It goes from story of individuals to a story of a nation with a mission. What else happened? I'm actually looking for the obvious. Where have the Jewish people been? In Egypt. Have they been partying there? No, they're slaves, right? We have 400 years of slavery between the end of the last story, the patriarchs, and what's going on now. 400 years of isolation, 400 years of separation, right? We read last week, right, that God heard the cry of his people and now is moving to free them. But there were 400 years of distance between God and the people of Israel. And to some degree, there needs to be a reintroduction, right? There needs to be a reintroduction between God and the people of Israel. And God is saying here, look, things are now going to be different. Things are now going to be different. The way in which I dealt with the patriarchs is now going to be different to the way in which I'm going to deal with you. Now, we've talked about that a little bit in terms of, all right, it's a difference between individual and a nation, but what does that mean? What does that mean? What's the difference between how God related to the Jewish people as the patriarchal family and to how God is relating to the people of Israel now in this story? And then, by the way, I'm going to follow it up with, and how God is relating to us now. Yeah.
He's there as a guide, where in Exodus, it's more of a leadership role, a protector, and someone who's taking people out and actively helping them get out of the situation that they're in.
So in the book of Genesis, Mark is saying that God is there really as a guide, right? And now, in this situation, God is there much more almost as maybe a general, kind of leading the people out, is taking a different role, let's go with that a little bit more. You guys are on the right track. Yeah, Michal.
Well, God dealt with the patriarchs, kind of individually, and they got feedback and they had their give and take. But with Moses, God's interacting with Moses, and now Moses has to go and deal with the people, and then he has to deal with the people, and then he has to come back to God, and they have to discuss it. It's way more complicated.
It is more complicated, and there's some distance there, right? In the book of Genesis, God is sort of talking and interacting with all of the major characters. Personally. Right? Personally. Whether through dreams with Joseph, right? But you see this personal relationship with all of the major characters and God. With the notable exception of Moses, we don't see that. God is now more distant from the people. Right? And by the way, we're going to see in a few weeks, some of that is by the people's demand. Right? They were standing at Mount Sinai. God was speaking to everybody, and the people went, whoa, 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 whoa. That is too much. Moses, you go up there, you take care of this, and tell us what God says. Right? So we see now a distance between the relationship between God and the people. And we actually see a progression. We see a clear progression. I've spoken about this before. From the early days of Genesis, going all the way through the Bible. Right? In the beginning, Genesis chapter 2, right? God was there walking in the garden with Adam and Eve, making clothes for them when they found out and realized after eating from the tree that they were naked, right? God made the clothes according to this. Our midrash, our stories say that it was God who closed the door to the ark for Noah. Like if everyone was inside, how do you close the door? God did it. God closed it and shut it up. We see this personal relationship between Abraham and God. A little less so with Isaac. Isaac is kind of an interesting character. But certainly with Jacob and even with Joseph. And that was really everybody. Like that was the story. The story was about them. Now we start to see some distance. We see Moses as the intermediary. And that's going to go on really through the next 4 books. Give you 1 second, Marge. It's going to go on through the next 4 books. And then we see even more distance with the prophets. That God doesn't actually speak anymore directly. Right? We say that Moses was the last person to whom God spoke face to face. So we see some distance now with the prophets. And with each successive generation, we see more and more distance. Which puts us to some degree where we are today. And I'll get back to that in a second. Marge.
But you're also seeing, I think, it's a finish swelling group of numbers, and it was becoming then a nation.
Correct. The nature of our relationship has changed from really a relationship of individuals with God to now a national relationship, right? A national covenant that we have with God. And that's the nature of that covenant has changed as well, right? From a personal deal, right, between Abraham and God to a communal deal. And we actually see it inside of this text as well. Because if we go back to this and we say, look, I didn't make myself known to the individuals. And the Torah names each one separately. The Torah could have said to the patriarchs, could have grouped them together, but no. Because the Torah recognizes that each one, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had their own unique relationship with God. But I didn't make myself known to them. I established my covenant with them. And now I have heard the moaning of the Israelites. because the Egyptians are holding them. Therefore, I say to the Israelite people, I am Adonai. I am this new iteration of our relationship. That iteration is very often associated with justice. The rabbis like to connect the different names of God in the Bible with attributes to God. In this case, this name is associated often with the attribute of din, of justice. And it's as if the Torah is telling us, after 400 years of slavery, justice has arrived. Justice has arrived. So, we see a huge transition in just these couple of verses. We see a transition from individual to national. We see a transition from intimate to more distant. And we see a transition from a God who is sort of emotionally involved and engaged, for good and for bad. Like, we could argue that, when God, the story of Noah, when God decided to wipe out the earth, that was kind of an emotional response, right? To now this more distant leader, whether it be a general or some sort of a leader that has that set of being a little farther away. And it's the beginning of a change that we still struggle with. Because we today feel even more distant, right? We don't have any of these miracles to be able to say, I was there standing when I saw the Red Sea split, right? That'd be pretty impressive, pretty convincing to me, right? Or Mount Sinai on fire and hearing God's voice. That distance seems to be there. And we start to struggle with it. We start to learn how to deal with some of that distance in the book of Exodus as God transitions from, as he says, El Shaddai, this personal God, to this God of community. Any questions or comments before we actually start to read all of this? I want us to think about this and be listening, watching for these transitions as we go through these next few weeks. Fred.
Wasn't God speaking directly to the prophets, like Zechariah and so on, in Hebrews 12:9, where Zechariah talks about God defeating the nations that come upon Jerusalem?
Yeah. So Fred's asking, the prophets definitely speak in terms of, and God told me, right? But the rabbis come and say that the visions, because they were visions, the dreams were as if it was through sort of a curtain, as opposed to Moses, where it was face to face and clear, right? There was a little bit more distance from that, and certainly after the age of prophecy, that goes away completely. Any other questions? Please.
Could you say that there is increase, so there's this distance, but he's still El Shaddai. He hasn't stopped being El Shaddai.
Yes.
He takes on this new face. And then as the story progresses and you start to hear about the law, the commandments of God, you start to know him and his heart. And
Yes.
Intimacy through that.
Yeah, what's your name? Carl brings up a good point, that the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Sometimes we still, El Shaddai is still there, still an opportunity, a pathway for us, but now Adonai, right, is coming in and presenting a different road, a different path. And as you said, we're going to now, in a few weeks, get the commandments. Those commandments are now going to define the relationship between us and between God, that covenant, in a different way than was ever defined beforehand, right? Those expectations, 100%. Good.